On the Pokrovsk axis, a Russian assault column moved into a monitored zone and was struck while still in motion. What stands out is not the size of the explosion, but the speed at which the situation changed. In seconds, a formation advancing under armored cover turned into scattered soldiers forced to abandon their vehicles, break into small groups, and search for survival in a space where every pause could be detected. At that point, the objective was no longer about pushing forward a few hundred meters, but about maintaining tempo to avoid collapse. So how did the first detection at Pokrovsk unfold? Why was the initial target lock enough to trigger a chain reaction across the entire assault element? And what happened immediately after that opening strike? Let military force walk you through it. The battle around Pokrovsk often starts before the first trench is reached, because Ukrainian UAV units treat the approach route as the real decisive zone. This matters in a sector built around roads and tree lines, where timing and spacing decide whether an assault reaches a contact line with enough cohesion to fight. A Russian assault element moving toward this area typically combines a BMP with several troop-carrying vehicles, and that structure signals an intent to move infantry forward under armored cover while keeping speed. The plan depends on staying organized long enough to close distance, because once vehicles slow down, the column becomes predictable and easier to track. Ukraine's response is designed to cut that plan at the earliest stage. Reconnaissance drones search for movement patterns, confirm the route, and set conditions for a strike before the assault can choose its own moment of contact. The BMP becomes the priority target because it is the hinge of the formation. It provides protection for dismounts, sets the pace, and gives the rest of the vehicles a reference point for spacing. When that lead vehicle is disabled, the assault enters its first turning point. Speed drops, spacing collapses, and the column is forced into hesitation, which creates the time window that UAV-enabled targeting needs. Once the lead vehicle is hit, the assault shifts into a second phase that is often more damaging than the first, the dismount problem. Infantry now faces a choice with no good outcome: stay close to the vehicle and risk repeat strikes, or leave it and move across exposed ground in smaller groups. Either decision breaks cohesion, and cohesion is the currency an assault spends to keep moving. As men scatter toward cover, command and control weakens because leaders cannot see everyone, radios fill with short, urgent calls, and movement becomes uneven. The key effect is delay rather than destruction. A delayed assault loses synchronization with support elements, and every extra minute in the approach zone increases exposure to follow-on strikes. A stopped vehicle also becomes a fixed point that can be revisited, while scattered soldiers create visible motion that is easier to track than a clean advance. At that stage, the mission narrows from advance to survival. Because the formation is no longer solving the battlefield problem in front of it, it is solving the time problem around it. This is how a small tactical sequence can decide the shape of a wider push. With the lead platform removed, the immediate question is no longer whether the assault can keep moving forward, but whether the dismounted infantry can exit the observation zone before pressure escalates. Once the BMP is struck, the battle shifts from metal to men, and the consequences unfold in seconds rather than minutes. Russian infantry who survive the initial impact are forced to abandon the damaged vehicle and scatter across open ground in search of cover. What appears at first to be a standard dismount drill quickly becomes a desperate movement, because the protection and mobility that once held the unit together are suddenly gone. Instead of regrouping behind armored shielding, soldiers find themselves exposed, separated, and uncertain about the next command. This moment is critical because infantry doctrine assumes that dismounting under fire is followed by coordinated action, not isolation. In practice, however, the sudden loss of a fighting vehicle often breaks the rhythm of an assault and replaces it with confusion. Small groups run toward tree lines, ditches, or shell craters, hoping that distance from the burning hull will reduce risk. Yet that movement creates multiple targets rather than one, and it multiplies the challenge of maintaining control. FPV drones, already circling above, adapt quickly to this fragmentation. Instead of striking a single armored platform, operators begin tracking individuals or pairs who move unevenly across the terrain. The pursuit does not require heavy firepower. It requires patience, observation, and precise timing. Each small group becomes vulnerable in turn because dispersion removes the overlapping fields of fire that normally protect infantry during withdrawal. The more they spread out, the harder it becomes to support one another. Communication also suffers at this stage. Radios may be damaged, lost, or silenced to avoid detection. Verbal coordination is limited by distance and the noise of ongoing explosions. Without a central reference point, soldiers struggle to determine where the line of control now lies. This breakdown reduces not only morale, but also operational clarity. Units that cannot see one another cannot synchronize movement, and that lack of synchronization creates further openings. The emphasis of the engagement therefore moves beyond destroying hardware. It becomes an effort to erase the possibility of reorganization. If infantry cannot regroup, they cannot resume their mission. They cannot provide covering fire for others who remain pinned. They cannot secure the ground that was meant to be taken. In effect, the battle transitions from physical damage to structural disruption. Military studies consistently show that cohesion is the foundation of combat effectiveness. When cohesion dissolves, combat power declines even if casualties remain limited. In drone-saturated environments, this process accelerates. An isolated soldier is not merely at personal risk. He represents a fragment of a unit that has lost its internal links. FPV operators exploit that reality by continuing to shadow retreat paths and probable gathering points. The aim is to deny time and space for reassembly. Footage from similar engagements across the front shows drones hovering near tree clusters or along shallow trenches where scattered troops attempt to hide. The goal is not always immediate elimination, it is to prevent stabilization. When fighters remain under constant watch, every pause becomes dangerous. Attempts to regroup are interrupted before they solidify. The psychological effect compounds the tactical one. Soldiers who know they are being observed hesitate longer before moving, and that hesitation extends exposure. Commanders positioned further back receive incomplete reports and must make decisions based on uncertainty. They may delay reinforcements, fearing that additional vehicles could meet the same fate. As a result, the original push loses momentum. What began as a vehicle strike evolves into a broader paralysis of initiative. Once personnel are detached from their transport and formation integrity collapses, every route of withdrawal and every temporary halt becomes the next focal point for unmanned surveillance and attack. As the fighting intensifies, the focus shifts from armored vehicles to the lighter platforms that sustain movement, and these assets increasingly come under direct attack while still in motion. Vans, civilian cars, all-terrain vehicles, and other soft transports are struck along approach routes that were once considered secondary. In several documented engagements, some vehicles appear to hit mines first, losing mobility before a drone strike follows to finish the target. This layered method reflects a clear pattern. Mines create delay and disorder, while FPV drones deliver the decisive blow once the vehicle is immobilized or slowed. Soft transport becomes a preferred objective because it carries personnel, ammunition, and communication gear that determine whether an assault can maintain tempo. An infantry unit may survive the loss of a single armored platform, but it struggles to function when resupply vehicles are removed. Without steady delivery of rounds and equipment, a push begins to lose coherence. These vehicles move more frequently and more visibly than heavy armor, which increases their exposure. They travel along dirt roads, narrow tracks, and open fields where concealment is limited. Their speed is often their only protection, yet that speed becomes irrelevant once a mine or obstacle forces a halt. When a vehicle is slowed or stopped, it presents a fixed point that is easier to track from above. Drone operators monitor these predictable pauses and wait for the moment when passengers dismount or attempt repairs. The mine serves not only as a destructive device, but also as a trigger that shapes the next stage of the engagement. It forces the column to compress or divert, creating congestion along narrow routes. Following vehicles must wait or attempt to bypass the obstacle, and both options increase exposure time. In this environment, the road itself becomes an instrument of control. When mobility corridors are restricted, formations stretch out and lose mutual support. Units that were meant to advance in sequence are pulled into a slower rhythm that is easier to anticipate. The delay makes their path more predictable. Observers can identify likely choke points, crossroads, and bends where vehicles reduce speed. FPV drones exploit these patterns by positioning along expected lines of movement rather than chasing random targets. The result is a sequence of engagements that appears systematic. One vehicle is halted by a mine. A second slows behind it. A drone descends. Within minutes, routine movement turns into a stalled column under pressure. As these incidents repeat, the approach route transforms into a prolonged trap. Drivers attempt to accelerate through exposed stretches, yet higher speed often reduces awareness and increases the risk of entering a monitored zone. Those who slow to scan for danger extend their time under observation. Either choice carries cost. The cumulative effect is operational strain rather than sudden collapse. Commanders must allocate additional resources to route clearance and reconnaissance before each movement. This requirement consumes time and personnel intended for offensive action. Momentum erodes as synchronized arrival of troops and supplies becomes harder to guarantee. Each delay ripples backward through the formation and affects timing at multiple levels. The battlefield logic shifts from rapid maneuver to cautious advance. When vehicles no longer guarantee speed or protection, they cease to function as enablers of initiative. They become risks that require constant mitigation. In such conditions, the next phase of combat moves closer and faster. Because once transport no longer provides momentum or shielding, engagements tighten into extremely short-range encounters where reaction time is measured in seconds rather than minutes. At this stage of the battle, FPV drones shift from extended tracking to close-range ambush, relying on concealment and precise timing rather than prolonged pursuit. Operators position their drones near likely approach paths, staying low behind vegetation, damaged structures, or shallow terrain features, and remain motionless until a target enters an optimal engagement window. Instead of circling overhead, the device waits quietly at ground level, reducing visual and acoustic cues that might alert nearby troops. When a vehicle or small group moves into range, the drone accelerates in a sudden burst, covering the final distance in seconds. The key advantage lies not only in the explosive charge, but in the compression of reaction time to nearly zero. A defender who has several seconds to process danger can dive for cover or change direction. A defender who has less than a second often cannot complete even the first movement. This approach transforms proximity into a weapon in itself. Close ambush blurs the line between perceived safety and imminent threat. A stretch of road that seemed quiet moments earlier can become a kill zone without visible preparation. Because the drone waits rather than chases, there is no extended warning phase that allows gradual adjustment. Opposing forces are forced to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. They may slow to scan their surroundings, which reduces speed and prolongs exposure. They may accelerate in an attempt to pass through danger quickly, which narrows observation and increases the chance of oversight. Both responses carry risk. Repeated ambushes influence broader movement patterns. Russian units encountering these strikes often change routes, avoid familiar tracks, and split into smaller elements to reduce concentration. However, dispersal weakens mutual support and reduces coordinated fire coverage. Separated groups become easier to isolate and engage in sequence. Efforts to avoid one threat can therefore create openings for another. This dynamic places constant pressure on command decisions and reshapes how ground forces approach even short movements. The psychological impact of close-range drone ambush is significant. Unlike distant artillery, which follows recognizable trajectories and produces audible warning, a concealed drone appears abruptly at eye level or below. Troops cannot rely on sound or visible arcs to anticipate impact. Every pause near a building, Every stop at a crossroads and every brief halt for coordination carries latent danger. Persistent uncertainty alters behavior. Soldiers may hesitate before crossing exposed ground or before regrouping after movement. Even short hesitation can disrupt timing within a unit and weaken coordination. Commanders must weigh the need for speed against the need for caution, knowing that either choice involves exposure. When a threat is detected at the last moment and small arms fire is directed toward the approaching drone, the difference in tempo often proves decisive. The drone advances in a straight line with total commitment to impact. Human response requires recognition, decision, and physical action, each consuming fractions of a second. In extremely close engagements, those fractions accumulate faster than defenders can compensate. As a result, the outcome of the encounter is frequently determined almost immediately after the drone becomes visible. The group advances along the outer wall of a shattered structure, believing the immediate danger has shifted after earlier explosions forced them to abandon their vehicle. Yet the sense of temporary security disappears when one soldier spots movement above the rubble line and raises his rifle toward a fast-descending FPV drone already aligned on its approach. Several men fire almost at once, attempting to build a defensive response while shifting their footing and lowering their profiles. But the drone does not adjust course because its line of attack was chosen before the soldiers fully understood they were being targeted. From the ground, the encounter feels sudden and chaotic, yet it is in fact the final stage of a sequence that began with prior observation, meaning that by the time rifles open fire, the aircraft has already entered a distance where reaction replaces maneuver. Rounds pass close, but the closing speed reduces the window for correction, and the difference in preparation becomes decisive as the drone commits to impact within seconds, leaving almost no opportunity for coordinated repositioning or withdrawal. As the strike unfolds, surviving troops attempt to break contact by moving in separate directions and using debris for cover. Yet these actions occur after the critical moment has already narrowed their options. The advantage of the drone lies less in explosive power than in control of timing and angle, because it approaches from a direction that limits sustained exposure to defensive fire while maintaining a direct path that shortens the defender's opportunity to adjust aim. Human response follows a sequence of recognition, decision, and movement, each requiring measurable time even under stress. The operator, by contrast, has already observed the target area and selected the commitment point in advance, allowing the final acceleration to unfold without hesitation. In this compressed exchange, even disciplined resistance struggles to reverse the geometry once distance collapses. Each soldier reacts individually, focusing on immediate survival rather than coordinated defense, and formation cohesion weakens as the clash tightens into a matter of seconds under persistent observation from above. When the smoke clears, the surviving troops withdraw from the exposed corner while scanning rooftops and nearby terrain with heightened tension, aware that the presence of one drone suggests a broader unmanned presence in the sector. Reports move rearward through strained communication links, forcing commanders to reassess movement along that corridor without full visibility of the threat. The stretch of ground that had seemed usable minutes earlier is now treated as monitored space where proximity can quickly turn into contact. Spacing between soldiers increases, pauses are shortened, and routes are reconsidered to avoid predictable patterns. The brief encounter therefore produces consequences beyond the immediate loss, because it alters tempo along that axis and injects hesitation into subsequent actions. As the battle continues, each movement must account for the possibility that another drone is already positioned nearby, waiting for distance to close once again and compress the timeline of reaction. As darkness settles over the battlefield, the expectation of reduced activity quickly proves false, because UAVs equipped with thermal imaging begin sweeping tree lines, shallow fighting pits, and the walls of damaged structures where infantry attempt to conceal themselves. Thermal sensors do not depend on visible light, and camouflage that may hide outlines during the day often fails to mask body heat at night. Through infrared optics, human signatures stand out against cooler ground and vegetation, turning hiding places into detectable points of interest. Soldiers who once relied on darkness to regroup or recover now operate under the assumption that observation continues even when the sky appears empty. Limited movement to adjust position or rotate sentries can produce detectable heat patterns. As a result, night ceases to function as a reliable pause in the fighting. Instead, it becomes a period of sustained tension in which units struggle to rest or reorganize without risking exposure. Fatigue accumulates when troops remain alert for overhead surveillance long after direct contact has ended. The psychological burden grows as well, since the absence of visible threat no longer guarantees safety. Darkness, once associated with concealment, becomes another contested domain. At the same time, unmanned systems expand their focus beyond individual infantry to infrastructure and support elements that sustain operations. Bridges, overpasses, field encampments, artillery positions, multiple launch rocket systems, and supply vehicles targeted during night operations. A bridge represents a choke point that channels movement along a predictable path, and when it is damaged, forces must reroute and extend travel time across exposed alternatives. This delay can affect not just a single unit, but an entire sector that depends on synchronized arrival. Artillery and rocket systems are engaged to weaken the firepower that maintains pressure at the front. If these assets are disrupted, the ability to respond quickly or suppress opposing positions declines. Supply vehicles are struck to interrupt the flow of ammunition and fuel, which directly affects how long units can sustain engagement. By targeting these elements under cover of darkness, the unmanned network attacks the operational framework rather than isolated contact points. When personnel, mobility routes, and fire support are all drawn into continuous observation and disruption, the battle is shaped by the speed at which detection turns into action, and the side that compresses that sequence gains a decisive advantage. The engagement ultimately unfolds as a rapid operational chain in which reconnaissance identifies movement, targets are assigned, and FPV drones launch within minutes to block maneuver before it matures into a larger threat. The decisive factor is not a single dramatic strike, but the speed at which detection turns into action, locking the opposing force into a constant cycle of reaction. The sequence follows a clear progression inside the battle itself, beginning with the disabling of armored vehicles, forcing infantry to disperse, disrupting mobility through attacks on soft transport, tightening pressure through close-range ambush, and then widening the focus toward crossings, fire support, and logistics. Each step builds on the previous one, compressing time and limiting recovery space. If this tempo continues, Russian forces will be compelled to disperse further and invest more resources into counter-drone measures. Yet such adjustments may slow movement and raise organizational costs across the front line. Understanding how modern warfare unfolds is not about celebrating destruction, but about learning how conflicts escalate and why preventing them requires informed citizens. If this analysis brings clarity to the realities behind today's battlefields, continue studying the facts and engage in discussions that support accountability, stability, and long-term peace. Subscribe to Military Force for clear, responsible battlefield reporting that values knowledge, critical thinking, and the pursuit of a more peaceful future.